rise, or I suppose the re-rise of youth-driven protests in the Arab world, that drive is getting younger, and we talk about what are the differences that we're seeing in terms of this new rise of protests that are different to the kind of Arab Spring back in the beginning of the decade.
So over the course of this year, we have seen 4 leaders forced to resign in the Arab world because of mass protests which have called for more fairness, less corruption, and in the cases of Iraq and Lebanon, an end to the sectarian system of power shaking, and an end to the sectarian system of power sharing. And it is astonishing that these protests have resembled the Arab Spring in a key sense, that they have been almost entirely peaceful. That's actually amazing. Many analysts have been expecting there to be some kind of second wave of Arab uprising, but they have anticipated that that could be much more violent, much more radical, because we have seen peaceful movements crushed in the past. And certainly that is a dynamic that's happened in Syria, where ISIS came to flourish as a peaceful protest movement was crushed. It's fascinating that you see young people willing to go into the street despite major threats of being killed that they face. And it suggests there's some combination of desperation and hope, that they still think there is a possibility for systemic change, but that there's no other way to get it. No one else will help them except themselves.
Absolutely, and we've seen sort of minor violence in protests in Britain, around the climate issue, and we've seen increasing violence in Hong Kong protests, which have gone on and on. And like you said, not too much of an issue, quite peaceful protests in the Arab world. What message does that send to the sort of Western powers and the further Eastern powers about maybe the change in the way that this up-and-coming, this generation that's now coming of age in that world are facing these political issues that they have?
At the time of the 2011 Arab uprisings, the peaceful mass nature of the protests sent a major wake-up call to Western governments who thought there is potential for democracy in this region.
Yeah.
And then somehow Western governments lost patience because, guess what? Democracy hasn't been achieved in 8 years, and it wasn't going to be achieved by having a committee write a new constitution or have elections held in a really short time period. Transitions take a very long time, and this is a real difficulty because you have 2 sets of actors who have unrealistically short-term expectations. One is often youth themselves who feel change is overdue and who fear that gradual reform is just an excuse for doing nothing. But also people in international governments who should know better, because they're very often only in office for a few years themselves, work to very short time horizons where something is seen as over before it's even begun.
Absolutely, and you're an expert on the matter, on the region. We talked about this a lot today. That for me feels like one of the key issues, is that maybe at the higher level in the Western powers, they just can't quite grasp the complexity of the region from a social, a demographic, a geopolitical sense. Do you get that? Do you feel that? Is that fair to say?
It's hard at the political level to take on that complexity and identify where you as a leader can make that impact. So I think you'll find that among diplomats and among analysts, there's a very good sense that deep institutional and economic progress is needed to address the mix of social, political and economic needs that people have. But that doesn't make a catchy slogan for a prime minister. So often the goals that are set by governments are much more short term. We've been discussing this here today, where there have been some fascinating discussions about Gulf security, and it's been said that there's much more focus on trying to keep the nuclear deal with Iran alive than to address the much deeper and complex regional security issues that keep Iran at odds with its neighbours, because many leaders see them as simply too difficult.
Sure, and it's almost essentially sort of a, use a better term, sort of notch on the bedpost, really. When we talk about the short-term, sort of nature of political campaigning today in the West, any kind of immediate movement is better than working to kind of long-term diplomatic solutions. Is that kind of what we've seen with the approach, or at least the kind of foreign policy approach from the Trump administration?
I think there's a wider problem of short-termism, and it is exacerbated by the high-speed nature of the media, that people are very often looking for quick wins.
I want to ask you a little bit about the generation that's suffering a little bit more, which is the displaced generation in the Arab world. When we look at neighboring countries to Syria and Iraq who've kind of been burdened with the fallout, in the refugee camps in Jordan, in Lebanon, these people, a lot of Syrian refugees, they are going to be coming of age as a generation that will need to start rebuilding their nations. A lot of them have missed huge years of schooling. We don't have any idea what level they're at.
No.
With such a strong sense of pride and purpose in the youth generations that we're seeing, with those that are left out of that system, what do we do from a global perspective? How do we come together to be able to kind of reintroduce them into society, into their own countries, and empower them with the skills that they need to be able to be effective in rebuilding, in reshaping? How do we do that?
It's a huge question, and we should acknowledge there are some good efforts that are going on, that there are governments, including in the Gulf here, Kuwait, who have donated and convened donors and tried to work on education programs, but the scale is so enormous when such a large part of a country's population is forced outside. And one particularly worrying angle is that many young Syrians are being born stateless. They're living in countries in the region where they don't have the right to citizenship, but their own government won't register them or recognise them, and it's unclear who at all is able to give them protection.